They called us cowards in 47 languages simultaneously, and not one of them had the biology to understand what my silence actually meant. I am Sarah Voss, and I have been humanity's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 6 years, 4 months, and 11 days. I know this because I count. I count the days the way soldiers count bullets, not obsessively, but carefully, because things that seem limitless have a way of running out when you need them most. 6 years of sitting in that enormous chamber, listening to species debate trade routes and border agreements, and the careful, measured language of civilizations that have never had to rebuild themselves from nothing. 6 years of smiling at the right moments, nodding at the right moments, speaking only when I was certain every word would land exactly where I intended it. Today, I was not smiling. The Grand Convocation Hall of the Galactic Council is built inside a hollowed megastructure in orbit around Kepler 442b. The architects were the Drivathi, a species so old they watched the first human fires from telescopes so primitive that the images took decades to arrive. They built the hall the way they build everything, with beauty as the first priority and function as a quiet afterthought. The ceiling is transparent, and through it you can see the stars in their thousands, cold and steady and completely indifferent to what happens beneath them. I have always found that comforting. Stars do not have opinions. They simply exist, burning for billions of years until they stop. I arrived that morning expecting nothing unusual. The session was scheduled for routine agenda items, a revision to the Outer Arm shipping lane agreements, a formal welcome for the newly contacted Pelthrani, and a proposal to expand the Council's emergency communication network. I had prepared remarks for 2 of the 3 items. My travel mug of coffee, smuggled through 3 security checkpoints because the Council's hospitality division had not yet learned that humans required it the way other species required atmospheric balance, sat cooling on my desk. My aide, a young man named Devraj, had his data tablet ready and was already making small notations in the margin of his agenda with a stylus he had owned since university. The session opened on time, which was unusual. Archdelegate Voran of the Centauri Confederacy was presiding, which was not. Voran was efficient in the way that very confident beings are efficient. He moved things along because he expected the universe to comply with his preferences, and so far the universe largely had. He was tall by any standard, pale blue, with the 4-jointed limbs of his species, and a face that communicated nothing except the faint impression of mild impatience. I had dealt with him on 12 separate occasions. I had never enjoyed a single one. The shipping lane revision passed with minor amendments. The Pelthrani welcome was warm and brief, and their young delegate sat in the visitors' gallery with wide, curious eyes that swept across every species in the room as though memorizing them. I caught her gaze once and smiled. She blinked twice rapidly, which I had been told was the Pelthrani equivalent of a nod of acknowledgement. Then Voran said the words that changed the nature of the day entirely. I call the Council's attention to File Reference 77 Alpha, a formal motion submitted by the Centauri Confederacy, co-signed by 12 member civilizations, requesting that the human civilization of the Sol system be reclassified under Article 19, Section 4, as a non-combatant observer civilization, pending review. The hall did not go quiet. It went to a different kind of noise, the shuffling, murmuring, data tablet tapping noise of a room full of beings who had been expecting this and were now settling in to watch it happen. I looked at Devraj. He was looking at me. His stylus had stopped moving. I picked up my coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. It was cold. I drank it anyway. A non-combatant observer civilization is a precise category in Council law. It means exactly what it sounds like: a species acknowledged to exist, permitted to observe Council proceedings, but stripped of any formal standing as a military or strategic partner. It means no defense agreements, no mutual aid clauses, no right to call for Council protection in the event of a threat. It means being reclassified, in all the ways that matter, as something that does not need to be taken seriously. It is not an insult the Council has used lightly. It is, in fact, a category originally designed for civilizations that had not yet developed the capacity for interstellar travel, not for species that had been sitting in this very chamber for 6 years. Vorhan began presenting the evidence. It was thorough. I will give him that. His team had compiled 3 centuries of human behavior, every peace treaty, every negotiated ceasefire, every instance where human forces had stood down rather than escalated, every diplomatic resolution that had replaced what might have been an armed conflict. They had noted the structure of human military forces, their emphasis on protection rather than projection, their rules of engagement that restricted the use of force even when force might have been strategically simpler. They had noted that humanity, in all its time in space, had never once fired on an alien vessel first. The chamber listened. Species after species indicated their agreement. The Kethur delegate, a broad, dark-armored being from a world where strength was demonstrated by how loudly one could announce it, made a sound I had come to recognize over 3 years of interactions as laughter. It was not a kind sound. It was the sound of something grinding against something else, rhythmic and deliberate, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck rise in a way I kept very carefully off my face. Devraj's stylus was still not moving. Under the table, very quietly, I pressed my hands flat against my thighs and held them there. My grandmother had a saying. She was a small woman who had lived through the resource wars as a child and rebuilt an entire agricultural cooperative in the years after, and she did not have patience for people who reacted before they had thought. She used to say, "The noise you make before you understand the situation is always the wrong noise." I understood the situation. What I did not yet understand was how badly they had misread us. I requested the floor. The request was denied by protocol. Under Article 22, a civilization under active reclassification proceedings could not offer testimony until all evidence had been entered into the record. I would have to wait. I sat back in my chair with the posture of someone who was entirely comfortable waiting, because I was. 6 years, 4 months, 11 days. I had learned to wait. Above the transparent ceiling, I could see the tiny lights of human observation shuttles holding formation at the council perimeter. Standard protocol, 2 shuttles on station whenever the primary delegate was in session. They looked small from here. Most dangerous things look small from a distance. I let Voran finish. I let all of them finish. The Kethur delegate added, near the end, that human soldiers wore armor specifically designed to absorb impact rather than project threat, and that any warrior who prioritized not being hurt over hurting others was, by definition, demonstrating fear of pain. Several delegates made sounds of agreement. I thought about what that armor actually represented. I thought about the 2-year training program candidates completed before they were permitted to wear it. I thought about what that training involved, and what it was designed to teach, and why, and I picked up my cold coffee and finished the last of it. The evidence period closed. Vorn looked at me with the expression of someone who has already decided what the outcome will be. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "the floor is yours." I stood up. The chamber was expecting an argument. You could feel it in the air, or the equivalent of air, the carefully maintained atmospheric blend that allowed 80% of the room to breathe without equipment. They were expecting me to defend, to explain our treaties, our peace protocols, our history of choosing diplomacy. They were expecting me to make the case that humans were not afraid, and they were prepared to find that case unconvincing. I did not make that case. I stood there for 3 full seconds without speaking. Long enough to let the silence become something the room had to sit with. Long enough for the Keth-Ur delegate to shift in his seat. Long enough for the young Pelthrani in the gallery to lean forward almost imperceptibly. Then I said, "How many of your civilizations have fought a war against yourselves and survived it?" Nobody answered. The question was not rhetorical in the way council questions usually were, precise, contained, directed at a specific procedural point. It was the other kind of rhetorical, the kind that opens a door and then stands back to let whoever is listening figure out what's on the other side. "I am going to tell you something about my species," I said, "that none of your intelligence reports contain, not because the information is classified, because it is not the kind of information that translates easily into data. It is the kind of information you have to be inside to understand." I had spoken in Galactic Standard, as required, but I had prepared this part of my response carefully, and I had worked with the translation systems for 3 weeks to make sure the concepts arrived with the correct weight. There are things in human experience that have no direct equivalent in the languages of species who evolved differently, not better or worse, just differently. The concept I was about to explain was one of them. "We have a word," I said, "restraint. It appears in your files about us frequently. You have interpreted it as a characteristic, a trait, something we possess naturally, the way some species naturally avoid confrontation due to evolutionary pressures, a biological default, something we are." I paused. "It is not something we are. It is something we choose. Every day, and we choose it because we know exactly what happens when we stop." I began with the numbers, because numbers are the language of the council, and they needed a foundation before I built anything on top of it. I told them about the 2 world conflicts of the 20th century. I gave them the scale, not in the soft language of historical summaries, but in the actual figures. Cities reduced to stone and dust, agricultural systems broken so completely that people died of hunger long after the fighting was over. Children who grew up in the wreckage and built the next generation of human civilization out of the pieces of the last one. I told them about the resource wars, which were more recent and which several species in this room had observed through long-range sensors without fully comprehending what they were seeing. A conflict that began over water and grain and breathable air, the kinds of things that become weapons when they become scarce. A conflict that ended not because one side defeated the other, but because both sides reached a point of exhaustion so complete that the only available energy left was the energy to stop. The chamber was quiet in a way it had not been quiet during Vorhan's presentation. That presentation had produced the quiet of agreement, the quiet of beings nodding along to something they already believed. This was a different quiet. This was the quiet of a room that was listening because it did not yet know what was coming. "I want to tell you about a place called Verdun," I said. I told them about it carefully. I did not use graphic language, because graphic language was not what this moment required. I used precise language. I told them about the geography, a narrow strip of land that became, for 10 months in a human year, called 1916, the site of one of the most sustained conflicts in human history to that point. I told them that 2 human nations sent their people to that place to fight over it, and that by the end, neither nation had significantly advanced its position, and the combined losses were staggering. "Why do I tell you this?" I said. "Not to shock you. Not to demonstrate that we are capable of cruelty. Every species with enough intelligence to build weapons is capable of cruelty. I tell you this because of what happened afterward. The people who survived that place, and the people who came after them, and the people who came after those people, they made a decision. Not a treaty, a decision. They decided that the thing that had happened at Verdun, and at 100 places like it, should never happen again. Not because they were told to, not because a governing body mandated it, because they had looked at it directly and found it unacceptable. I let that land. That decision, I said, is what your intelligence reports have been calling cowardice." The Keth-Ur delegate was no longer making any sound. His arms were still. I noted this and continued. "The armor that your delegate described as fear-based protective equipment," I said, "was designed by engineers who spent 2 years studying the history of human conflict to determine exactly which injuries did not need to happen, not which injuries could be avoided. Which injuries did not need to happen. There is a difference, and it is not a small one. It means the engineers began from the assumption that conflict was already a failure, that by the time someone needed that armor, something had already gone wrong, and their job was to limit the cost of that failure. That is not fear. That is the application of everything we learned about what conflict actually costs. A delegate near the back, from a species I recognized as the Orvathi, raised a patterned hand. Under the rules of proceedings, I could acknowledge or decline. I acknowledged. Ambassador, the Orvathi delegate said, in careful galactic standard, your argument appears to be that humanity's restraint is learned rather than natural. But does this not suggest that the underlying capacity for harm is merely suppressed, that it could return? I had expected this question. I had written 3 different answers and discarded 2 of them. Yes, I said. That is exactly what it suggests. And it is why we have spent 300 years building the institutions, agreements, and cultural practices that help us maintain the choice. Not because we have forgotten what we are capable of, because we remember it perfectly. Voron straightened in his chair. He had the look of someone who had brought a net to catch something small and had just noticed that what he was dealing with was not small. The de-escalation protocols your report cited, I continued, are not the instincts of a species that retreats from danger. They are the product of a civilization that has tested every other approach and documented the results. We have centuries of data on what happens when escalation is chosen freely and without constraint. We have the ruins of cities to prove it. We chose de-escalation the way a person who has been burned chooses not to touch the flame again, not because they have forgotten fire is hot, but because they remember it exactly. I was not raising my voice. I never raise my voice in council. Devraj had once asked me why, early in my first year, and I had told him that a raised voice tells your audience that you need them to feel something because your words alone are not doing the job. My words were doing the job. You have looked at 3 centuries of human behavior, I said, and you have seen a species that seeks peace. You are correct. We do seek peace. But I would ask you to consider what we sought before we learned to seek peace. I would ask you to consider what it took to teach us, and I would ask you to consider what it means that we learned. The chamber had gone to a kind of stillness that I had felt only twice before in my career. Once during a hostage negotiation on the 7th day when the other party finally understood what the actual options were, and once at the bedside of my grandmother in her last week of life, when the room was full of people and full of silence at the same time, a silence so heavy it had weight. You have classified our restraint as the behavior of a species that is afraid of conflict, I said. I am here to correct that classification. Our restraint is the behavior of a species that has been to the bottom of what conflict produces and made a considered decision about what it is willing to do and what it is not. That is not the behavior of a species that is afraid. That is the behavior of a species that has learned the difference between strength and noise. I looked at Voron directly when I said the last part. He did not look away, which I respected. He was wrong, but he was not a coward. The motion before this council, I said, asks you to reclassify humanity as a non-combatant civilization. I will not argue that the classification is an insult, though it is. I will argue that it is inaccurate. And I will leave you with a single question to consider before you vote. I paused. If we were truly afraid, what exactly do you imagine we are afraid of? I sat down. Devraj was looking at his tablet, but I could see from the angle of his jaw that he was not reading anything on it. The translation systems hummed quietly for a moment, completing the delivery of the final words in 47 languages. And then the chamber did something it had not done in its recorded history. It was quiet. Not the quiet of agreement, not the quiet of listening, not the procedural pause between speakers. The quiet of a room that had been handed something it needed to think about. I picked up my empty coffee mug, found it empty, and set it back down. Voron was the first to break the silence, because that was his role and he understood it. He called for procedural order in a voice that was steady and professional and contained, somewhere underneath it, something I had not heard from him before: uncertainty. He did not attempt a rebuttal. I had not expected him to. Instead, he moved immediately to open the floor for delegate responses, which was the standard next step, and also, I recognized, the move of someone who needed to distribute the weight of what had just happened across as many other people as possible. The Orvathi delegate spoke first, not to rebut, to ask another question, a genuine one, the kind that comes from a mind that has been moved from one position and is looking for new ground to stand on. She asked about the human approach to interspecies diplomacy, specifically whether the same principles that governed our internal conflict resolution had been applied to our relationships with other civilizations. I answered that yes, they had, and that this was not an accident. The frameworks we used in interstellar diplomacy had been built directly from the frameworks we used domestically, because we had found that the underlying dynamics were the same. A dispute between two nation-states and a dispute between two civilizations separated by light years had more in common than they had differences, and the tools that worked in one context translated, with modification, to the other. The Orvathi delegate made a note. Several other delegates made notes. The Dravathi elder, who was the oldest being in the chamber by a margin I had been told was measured in geological time, spoke next. Elder Sivath was not someone who spoke often. When they did, the room gave them a particular quality of attention that went beyond protocol. Sivath was the reason the hall's ceiling was transparent. They had requested it when the building was designed, on the grounds that any deliberating body should be able to see the stars, because the stars were the context for everything the council did, and forgetting that context was how bodies like this one became small. Sivath said, in their careful, unhurried voice, I recall when we first observed the signals from Saul, the debates we had about what we were witnessing, the disagreements about what those signals indicated about the nature of the species producing them. A pause that lasted long enough to be deliberate. I remember suggesting that we might be witnessing something unprecedented. I was told I was being optimistic. Nobody asked what Sivath had meant by unprecedented. The word hung in the chamber air, and everyone understood it. Vorn attempted to redirect. He noted, correctly, that the motion was still formally before the council and required a vote. He noted that the evidence in the record had not been invalidated, only recontextualized. He spoke with the authority of someone who had prepared a position and was not yet ready to abandon it, even if parts of it had become uncomfortable. And then the Keth-Ur delegate asked for the floor. I kept my face still. The Keth-Ur were a warrior culture in the most complete sense of the phrase, not in the way that word is sometimes used loosely to mean aggressive, but in the literal sense that their civilization had organized itself around the premise that strength was the measure of worth, and that every other value existed in relationship to that central one. They were not cruel by nature. They were, in fact, bound by extremely precise codes about when force was acceptable and when it was not. But they operated from a foundational assumption that the willingness to use force was the necessary precondition for being taken seriously, and anything that did not demonstrate that willingness was, by definition, beneath consideration. The Keth-Ur delegate, whose name was Grath Mon, stood. He was broader than Voron by a significant margin and moved with the deliberate economy of something that had never had reason to doubt its own physical presence. He looked at me for a moment before he spoke. I made a sound earlier, he said, that translated, in my language, as amusement. I directed it at you, and at what I believed you represented. He stopped. I would like to withdraw that sound from the record. The room processed this. In Keth-Ur culture, withdrawing an expression of contempt was not a small thing. It was not common enough that the council chamber had an established protocol for it. I would also like, Grathmon continued, to formally request a comprehensive cultural briefing on human military history, to begin at the earliest convenience of the human delegation. I said calmly, that briefing will take approximately 11 weeks. Grathmone said, without hesitation, "I will clear my schedule." 3 things happened in the next 12 minutes that I will not forget. The first was that 2 delegations quietly contacted the council secretary to withdraw their co-signatures from Voron's motion. The second was that a 3rd delegation followed. The third was that Voron called for the vote. The motion failed to reach quorum, and he announced the result in a voice so level and controlled that it was itself a kind of dignity. When the session closed, I did not stand immediately. I sat for a moment in the particular way I have learned to sit when something large has happened, not collapsed into it, not rigid against it, just present with it. Devraj was organizing his notes with careful, precise movements that I recognized as his version of the same thing. In the corridor outside the chamber, the air was different. Not the engineered atmospheric blend of the hall, but the slightly warmer, less precisely controlled air of the connecting passages. Delegates moved through it in clusters, some of them speaking quietly, some of them looking at their data tablets, some of them simply walking with the expressions of people rearranging their internal furniture. The young Pelthrani aide found me near the corridor junction. She was perhaps a century old by her species reckoning, which put her at something like an early professional, still new enough to this world to find it genuinely surprising. Her name was Eighth, and she had been in the gallery for the entire session, and her large, luminous eyes had the quality of someone who had seen something they had not expected to see and were still processing it. "Ambassador Voss," she said, and then stopped. In my experience, when someone begins a sentence and stops, they are usually trying to find the courage for the sentence they actually want to say, which is different from the sentence they started. I waited. "Are humans frightening?" she asked finally. I thought about the honest answer for a long moment, not because it was a hard question, but because the honest answer had more layers than a simple yes or no could carry, and I wanted to give her the layer that would actually be useful. "We frighten ourselves," I said. "That is the point. A species that is not frightened of itself has no reason to build the structures that keep it in check. We built everything, the treaties, the protocols, the institutions, the agreements, because we know what we are capable of when those things are absent. The fear is not weakness. The fear is the engine." Eighth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not expect that answer." "Most people don't," I said. "That's usually the beginning of understanding us." Back aboard the human transit vessel, the air smelled different from the council hall. Less engineered, more inhabited. Someone had made food earlier, and the ghost of it was still in the corridor, something warm and slightly spiced, the kind of smell that means a group of people has been present in a space long enough to fill it with something of themselves. Devraj had been with me since the shuttle, and he had been quiet in the particular way he was quiet after a significant session, not withdrawn, not distracted, just processing. He was 29 years old and had been my aide for 3 of my 6 years at the council, and in that time I had watched him develop from someone who carefully noted everything into someone who carefully understood it. There is a difference. The noting is the first stage. The understanding takes longer. I went to my office and filed the official report. It was straightforward. The motion had been presented. The evidence had been entered into the record. Testimony had been offered. The motion had failed to reach quorum. Recommend expanded cultural exchange programs with the Keth-Ur delegation specifically and the broader council membership generally. Note the Pelthrani delegation as a priority for early-stage diplomatic relationship building, given their recent contact and apparent cultural curiosity. Standard language, accurate. Completely inadequate to describe what had actually happened. I sent it anyway, because the official record is for the official purpose, and everything else is for other conversations. Devraj knocked on my open door with the side of his fist, which was his way of announcing himself without interrupting. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee, real coffee, the kind kept in a separate storage compartment from the standard supplies and labeled, in my handwriting, for significant occasions. He had made the judgment that this was one, which it was. "How did it go?" he asked, though he had been there and knew the answer. He was asking a different question, and we both knew it. They called us cowards, I said. Formally, in 47 languages. He handed me the mug. I wrapped both hands around it, because the ship's temperature regulation ran slightly cool, and I had never quite adjusted to it, despite 6 years. And, he said, and I reminded them what courage actually costs. He sat across from me, in the chair he always took in this room, slightly sideways, the way people sit when they are comfortable enough not to need to perform attention. Outside the viewport behind him, the stars were doing what stars do, which is exist, without comment, for billions of years. Grathmon withdrew his expression of contempt from the record, I said. Devraj looked up. The Keth-Ur delegate. Yes. That's not something they do. No, I said. It is not. He considered this. What do you think changed his mind? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I think he recognized something, I said. Not the history. He probably knew the outline of it already. I think he recognized the decision, the active, ongoing decision. I think that is something that translates across species, because it is not really about culture. It is about what it means to be capable of something and to choose otherwise. Devraj nodded slowly. He was looking at his coffee mug, and I could tell by the angle of his head that he was thinking through something. Do you think it will last? He said. The shift, in how they see us. This was the question I had been turning over since the session closed. It was not a pessimistic question. Devraj was not a pessimist, he was a realist, which is a different thing. A realist asks whether the change is structural or surface level, whether it has roots or whether it is the kind of shift that looks solid and then dissolves when the next event provides a new framework. Some of it will last, I said. Grathmon's request for a briefing will last. He made it publicly, and his culture does not make public commitments casually. The Orvathi delegates' thinking will shift, I believe genuinely. Sivath already knew. Sivath has always known. I paused. Voron will recalibrate. He is not someone who changes his fundamental assumptions easily, but he is someone who updates his operational understanding when the evidence requires it. That is actually more useful, in the long run. And the others? The others will talk about it. That is how these things move through a community of civilizations. Someone talks to someone else, and that person has a conversation with a third party, and eventually it works its way into the background assumptions that govern how decisions get made. It is slow, it is not satisfying, but it is real. We sat with that for a moment. The human observation shuttles were still out there. I could see the faint navigation lights through the viewport, steady and unhurried, maintaining their position the way they always did. They were not a threat display. They were simply present, the way humans are often simply present, in a way that gets misread, because the misreading is easier than the understanding. I thought about my grandmother, who built an agricultural cooperative out of the ashes of a world that had tried very hard to break itself. She had not been a dramatic person. She had not made speeches. She had planted things in broken ground and kept records of what grew and what did not, and she had shared those records with anyone who asked, and she had lived to see her grandchildren eat food that grew in soil she had brought back from the edge of nothing. I thought about the engineer who had designed the armor that Grathmon had cited as evidence of fear, a woman named Carol Bright who had spent 20 years studying injury patterns in conflict zones before she drew a single diagram, who had begun from the premise that every wound that did not need to happen was a failure, and whose work had, in the decades since, meant that the people who wore that armor came home at a rate that would have seemed impossible to the soldiers of a century before. I thought about all the people in between, the ones who had built the treaties, and the institutions, and the protocols, the ones who had sat in rooms far more difficult than the council chamber and refused to leave until something had been agreed upon, the ones who had given their lives, not in battle, but in the long, grinding work of building structures strong enough to make battle unnecessary. None of them would ever be in an intelligence report. None of them would be cited in a motion before the Galactic Council. They were the invisible architecture of the thing Voron had mistaken for cowardice. "You know what they still don't understand," I said. Devraj looked up. "They think the restraint is the thing," I said. "The outcome, the behavior they can observe. They do not yet understand that the restraint is only possible because of everything underneath it. You cannot build a bridge without a foundation. The foundation is the part you cannot see. They have been studying the bridge." Devraj turned this over for a moment. "Then what's the foundation?" I looked at the stars. "Everything we decided not to do again," I said. We finished our coffee. The ship moved through space in the calm, measured way it was designed to move, and outside the viewport the stars held their positions, patient as always, enormous and indifferent, and completely untroubled by the question of what the humans aboard the small vessel moving between them had understood about themselves today. There was nothing triumphant about it. That is the thing I want to be clear about, if I am ever asked to describe what that evening felt like. There is no triumph in being correctly understood at last. There is something else, something quieter, something more like the feeling of putting down a weight you have been carrying for so long that you had stopped noticing it was heavy. The Keth-Ur delegation sent a formal follow-up request that night, delivered through the Council's secure channel, confirming the briefing schedule and attaching a preliminary list of questions. There were 47 of them. I read through all of them before I went to sleep. They were good questions. They were the questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than looking for confirmation of what they already believed. That mattered more than I could explain in official language. The Pelthrani Aid 8th sent a personal message through the standard diplomatic channel, which was not the expected protocol for a junior staff member, but which I chose to read as cultural enthusiasm rather than procedural error. She wanted to know if humans had literature, stories, not historical records, but the kind of things that were made up, imagined, because imagination was useful or important or pleasurable in some way. I wrote back and told her that yes, we had quite a lot of it, and that if she was interested, I could arrange for a selection to be translated into Pelthrani Standard. She replied within minutes, with a string of affirmative signals that the translation software rendered as, "Yes, very much yes, please yes." I laughed at that, alone in my office. A small laugh, but a real one. I filed the final report of the day, closed my tablet, and stood at the viewport for a few minutes before going to bed. The human observation shuttles were holding formation, steady as ever, their navigation lights small and clear against the dark. The council megastructure was visible in the distance, its transparent dome catching the light of Kepler 442b's sun in a way that made it glow faintly, as though from the inside. Somewhere in that structure, delegates were having conversations that would take years to fully work themselves through the fabric of how the council operated. Somewhere, assumptions were quietly being revised. Somewhere, the fixed idea that human restraint was the same thing as human weakness was encountering the evidence that it was not, and the work of adjusting to that information was beginning, slowly, in the particular way that important things begin, without announcement, without drama, one changed mind at a time. I am Sarah Voss. I have been humanity's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 6 years, 4 months, and 11 days. I have spent those years learning to be patient, to be precise, to wait for the right moment, to speak, and then to speak without equivocation. I have sat in that chamber and listened to hundreds of debates and contributed to dozens of outcomes, and I have done all of it in the service of a species that has spent 10,000 years learning, the very hard way, what it wants to be. We are not the species that has never been afraid. We are not the species that has never made catastrophic choices, never turned our considerable intelligence toward purposes that haunted us for generations afterward. We are not the species that arrived at peace because peace was easy or natural or the path of least resistance. We are the species that arrived at it because we tried everything else first, kept the records, and decided. We are the species that frightens itself on purpose, because we have found that fear of our own worst possibilities is a better tool than the absence of it. We are the species that built restraint, not from gentleness but from knowledge, and that maintains it, not from weakness but from will. We are the species that sits in a chamber of 200 civilizations, and holds very still, while being called cowards, because we have learned, at a cost that would make the stars flinch if they cared about such things, that the noise you make before you understand the situation is always the wrong noise. The Galactic Council called us battle-fearing today, in 47 languages, in front of every civilization it represents. I answered them in one, and the universe was quiet for the first time in its recorded history of that hall, because even the stars, cold and enormous and billions of years patient, understood what the silence meant. It meant, look again. It meant, you have not yet understood what you are looking at. It meant, we are still here, we have always been here, and we are exactly what 6 years of patience looks like when it finally opens its mouth. Devraj knocked on my door one more time that night, just to say good night. He had his jacket over his arm and his tablet tucked under his elbow, and he looked like someone who had been part of something and was quietly, privately, glad about it. "Good night, Ambassador," he said. "Good night, Devraj," I said. He went. I turned back to the viewport. The shuttles held their position. The stars burned on. Somewhere in the council chamber, Voran was probably still at his desk, reorganizing his understanding of the day. I let him. Some recalibrations need the night. Outside, the universe was very large and very old, and it had seen a great many things. Today it had seen one more, a human, alone in a ship, drinking cold coffee at the end of a long day, watching the stars, not triumphant, not at rest, but present, which has always been the thing we do best. We show up, we endure, we remember, and when it matters, we speak.